Hi there, and welcome to this video on GCSE Biology for the AQA Specification, focusing on hormonal coordination in humans, and in particular on hormones in human reproduction. I'm Shumina from StudyMind, where we help you revise GCSE Biology with our helpful video tutorials, tailored to your subject, your specification, and to you. If you're new here, make sure you click the subscribe button. Whilst you are watching, please leave any comments below if you're unsure about anything, and let us know if it's your first time watching our videos so we can send you our free revision materials. We also have helpful timestamps below for each part of the video to help guide you through the specification. So let's get started. Hello there, and welcome to this tutorial on hormones in human reproduction. So, just to remind you, in the last lesson we looked at how osmoregulation occurs and the role of the ADH hormone in the excretion of water. And we also looked at how water is lost from the body as well as other nutrients. And then we finalised all of that by looking at dialysis and kidney transplants. So if you need to remind yourself about that topic before we move on to hormones in human reproduction, then do go back and watch that video. Okay, so today's session is going to be quite dense. We're going to be talking about the reproductive hormones in our body and relating this to the menstrual cycle in females. And finally, we're going to have a look at the role of hormones and how they interact with each other. So as per usual, these are our tutorial specification points. So we'll start off with the first two, and you can use this list as a checklist as you go through the video. So reproductive hormones are released during adolescence and lead to many changes. We call this puberty. So this leads to the development of secondary sex characteristics, which can be used to differentiate gender, but are not involved in reproduction. And we'll come on to look at examples of these. And other changes that occur during puberty are the production of sex cells, which are needed for reproduction. So let's go on to have a look at this process in males first. So testosterone is the main male reproductive hormone produced by the testes. And the role of testosterone is to stimulate sperm production. So testosterone is produced in the Leydig cells of the testes. So these are the testes here. And the Leydig cells themselves produce the testosterone. Now this leads to development of secondary sex characteristics in males and the synthesis of sperm. Now try to have a think of what these sex characteristics might be. I'll leave this here as a little clue. Maybe pause the video and just try to brainstorm. Okay, so some of the changes caused by testosterone include increased hair growth, increased muscle growth, the voice deepens and breaks, that's the male voice, remember, sperm production begins, and the penis and testes develop. So the way that I like to remember this is just think about the stages of development that you associate males going through during puberty. So you don't see young boys with beards, for example, but you see older boys and men with beards, and that's because they've been through puberty and they have this testosterone in this body, which then allows for the stimulation of their hair follicles and allows for beard and moustache growth. Now, testosterone is the main male reproductive hormone. In contrast, estrogen is the main female reproductive hormone, and it's produced in the ovaries. So estrogen causes ovulation, and this is the release of an egg from the ovaries. During puberty, eggs begin to mature, and this is so that they can take part in the menstrual cycle. Now, can you think of what secondary sex characteristics might be stimulated by estrogen? Again, here's a clue. Okay, so the changes caused by estrogen include underarm and pubic hair growth, sexual organs develop, breasts form, hips widen, and the voice gets slightly deeper. So in the same way that in males, testosterone leads to the development of secondary sex characteristics and the synthesis of sperm, in females we have estrogen also leading to the development of secondary sex characteristics, but remember the sex cell here is the egg, the reproductive cell. Now in reproduction, the sperm and egg come together and they fuse in fertilisation to form a zygote. And this zygote then divides via mitosis to form an embryo, and ultimately the cells in the embryo undergo cell differentiation. Now, several hormones are involved in the menstrual cycle of a woman: FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. Now, we'll look at this in more detail. Don't worry if this sounds a little foreign to you. So we're going to approach this by going through the steps of the menstrual cycle. So in order to approach this, we're going to go through the steps of the menstrual cycle and relate each step back to the hormone involved. So hopefully this will make it as clear as possible for you. So first of all, the uterus lining breaks down. Now this happens in the menstrual phase, which occurs over a period of 5 days. Now we can either look at this as the start or the end of the cycle, either or. Now the egg starts to mature due to a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. Or FSH for short. Okay? So this hormone starts to increase in concentration, which then triggers our egg to start to mature within our ovaries. Remember, this is the ovary here, and this is the fallopian tube, and that's the uterus here. So our lining of our womb has broken down, and the next stage of the cycle is for our egg to start to mature due to the release of follicle stimulating hormone. So this is our egg maturing. Now the egg has to be released due to luteinizing hormone. So that's our LH. So remember, FH stimulates our egg to start to develop. FSH stimulates our egg to develop. And our LH is what is triggering the release of our egg. So that's the egg being released from the ovary. Now, once the egg is released from the ovary, you can see it starts to pass into the fallopian tube. Now, when this female has sexual intercourse, the sperm that enters her uterus can then fertilise this egg. Now, fertilisation may occur. The uterus lining itself has to be maintained, and this is via the hormone progesterone. And this allows for this lining here to be maintained, so that if the egg is fertilised, as it travels through the fallopian tube via sperm, the egg then has a place to nestle, essentially, within the uterus. If the walls are thin and broken down, the egg won't be able to implant on the uterus lining. So remember, it's progesterone that is maintaining our uterus lining. Now, if fertilisation does not occur, our cycle repeats, and we're back to the beginning where we have our uterus lining breaking down. So you can see here that the uterus lining has been built up. It's maintained at this part by our hormone progesterone, and then it's going to start to break down if the egg is not fertilised. And then we get a repetition of the cycle. Now, if fertilisation does occur, then we have a positive feedback loop in which progesterone concentrations are maintained within the female's body, and therefore we have maintenance of the womb of the lining of the womb of the lady. So, as I said, if fertilisation does happen, a zygote develops which settles in the uterus lining, which is nice and thick due to this progesterone, which is maintaining the lining. This zygote then divides again and again, and an embryo is ultimately formed. And via the processes of cell differentiation and cell specialisation over the next 9 months, the embryo will develop into a baby. Now, the uterus lining needs to be remade each month to keep it strong, fresh and intact for a potential pregnancy. And that's why we have a cycle of destroying the lining and making and maintaining it. Now, try your best to remember the rough days as best you can. Definitely make sure you know that the cycle is 28 days, but here's a table to break down each day, each set of days as it goes by. So regarding the uterus lining breaks down between days 1 to 4. Then the uterus lining begins to build up due to the hormone estrogen. And this happens between days 4 to 15. And we can see here that both FSH and estrogen are high at this stage. Then the uterus lining is maintained due to progesterone between days 15 to 28. So our progesterone concentration is high. Now, the egg starts to mature due to FSH in day 3. Then the egg is released due to high luteinizing hormone, which we call ovulation, this release of the egg. And this is due to high levels of luteinizing hormone here. But you can see that estrogen is also high at this stage when ovulation occurs, because remember, estrogen is causing the uterus lining to build up, and we want egg release and uterus lining building up to be occurring at the same time so that the uterus lining is ready to receive our egg. And finally, the uterus lining begins to break down when progesterone concentrations increase. So perhaps copy these tables down in your notes. I think they would be really, really helpful because they define the days for you. Now, just to summarise these hormones, because we've been through quite a few and I don't want you to get confused, so let's go through each one. So we have luteinizing hormone, which, remember, is produced by the pituitary gland, and it's key in ovulation, so it's key in the release of our egg from our ovaries, and it's released mainly during day 14, so in the middle of our cycle. And that kind of makes sense because, remember, we don't want to release our egg when the uterus lining has broken down, which is around this stage. Here, the uterus lining is building up, and so it makes sense that mid-cycle is an appropriate time to release our egg because this is when our uterus lining is going to be well built up and ready to receive our egg if it is fertilised. Now, follicle-stimulating hormone is released mainly during days 2 to 3, and it's produced by the pituitary gland. And remember, it's key in maturation of egg. It stimulates the egg to develop. And therefore, it makes sense that it's being released early on in the cycle because our egg starts to develop whilst our uterus lining is being built up. Now, estrogen is released mainly during days 4 to 15. And estrogen is produced by the ovaries, and it's key in developing the uterus lining. So again, it makes sense that it's occurring at this stage between days 4 to 15 because this is when we want our uterus lining to be slowly growing up, ready to receive our egg. And estrogen has another role in stimulating a surge in luteinizing hormone in order to cause release of the egg. So estrogen has two main roles here: development of the uterus lining, but also in stimulating this surge of luteinizing hormone. Now, progesterone is released mainly during days 15 to 27, and it's produced by follicles in the ovaries. Progesterone is key in maintaining the uterus lining. Remember, we want to maintain this nice, thick lining of the uterus in order to receive our egg. And it's key in the end of the menstrual cycle. So the end of the menstrual cycle is reliant on the fall in progesterone, which then allows for the maintenance of the uterus lining to stop, and therefore for the uterus lining to break down and for the cycle to start over again. So estrogen is key in growing the uterus lining, whereas progesterone is key in maintaining the uterus lining. Now, this is a really common area to trip up on in the exam, so just make sure that you know that progesterone its role is maintaining the uterus lining, not in growing the uterus lining. And make sure you learn this topic really well in terms of the 4 hormones and the 7 steps, and be prepared to answer these 2 questions. Write in full the steps of the menstrual cycle, so that's worth 8 marks, so keep that in mind, you want to make 8 useful points. And explain the roles of LH, FH, progesterone and estrogen in the menstrual cycle. Now we're going to make this a little bit easier for you by breaking this down even further. So note that these next 2 parts are for higher tier only, but they can be quite useful in helping you understand the interaction of these hormones even more, so do stay tuned if you'd like to. So hormones work together in the menstrual cycle. Now there's a lot of writing on this slide, and what I like to do is just summarise it using diagrams. So we know that release of FSH stimulates the release of estrogen. So that's going to stimulate the release of, oopsie, that all disappeared. So let me just quickly jot that down again. So we have our FSH, which is going to stimulate release of estrogen. And when estrogen levels are high, there's going to be a negative feedback loop here in which it inhibits further release of FSH, which is a good thing because we don't want estrogen levels to keep rising. Once they get to an appropriate level, we want estrogen levels to stop rising, and therefore, in turn, we have to tell FSH to stop sending that signal to stimulate the release of estrogen. Now, estrogen itself stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone, and progesterone comes in to inhibit both FSH and LH. Then, as estrogen and progesterone drop, inhibition of FSH ends because we're getting rid of these negative feedback loops here. And therefore, at the end of the cycle, when estrogen and progesterone drop, we release inhibition of FSH. Therefore, FSH levels start to increase again, and look at where we are, we're back at the top. So definitely try to draw out a diagram like this to summarise it, because I think it makes it a lot clearer in your head. And maybe even rewind the video and watch that back again, because it makes beautiful sense when you put it into a format like that. So the reason why you need to know this is because they might ask you to extract and interpret data from graphs showing hormone levels during the menstrual cycle. So for example, let's have a look at this graph. So the uterus lining breaks down here at this early stage of the cycle, days 1 to 4. So this is because we have very low concentrations of our estrogen and progesterone. Now remember, estrogen is responsible for building up the lining of our uterus wall, and progesterone is responsible for maintaining it. So without both of these, we're essentially not going to be driving any growth or maintenance of the uterus lining. So it breaks down in days 1 to 4. Now days 4 to 15, we have our estrogen levels increasing, and that's what's stimulating our growth of our uterus lining here. Now, estrogen levels will peak at around day 14, 15. And remember, we also have high FSH at this point. And meanwhile, we have our LH and our progesterone, which are also rising. Because remember, our LH is going to stimulate the release of our egg from our ovaries. And our progesterone is slowly rising because in days 15 to 28, it needs to maintain our uterus lining. So this is the point at which progesterone is highest. Meanwhile, estrogen has fallen a little bit. And where are we? We've got our LH, which is also low because our egg has already been released. And finally, we also have our FSH, which is also low at this point in days 15 to 28. Now relate this, see how I related the lining of the uterus changing in character to the egg, because remember the lining wants to be nice and thick when the egg is released, and whilst the egg is developing, the lining is also going to be developing. So we can see that here. So remember in day 3 we have our uterus lining which is being broken down, and that's because of low concentrations of estrogen and progesterone. But meanwhile, we have FSH, which is allowing our egg to start to mature. Then remember, in day 15, our egg is released due to this surge in LH. And then in day 28, we have our uterus lining breaking down again because our progesterone is dropping. In this section, remember the progesterone was responsible for maintaining our lining of our womb, as we can see in this area here. It's nice and thick. Then as it starts to tail off, our lining of our womb will also start to break down. So you can see really nicely here how the levels of hormones cause uterus lining to break down and build up, and also trigger the development and release of the egg. So try to map these two together, the uterus and the egg, in order to relate it back to the hormones, and then it will make beautiful sense in your head. So let's have a look at some practice questions. So which of the following hormones are raised during day 4 to 14? So it's going to be more than one answer here that you have to select. Now remember what's happening in days 4 to 14. So perhaps pause the video at this point and I will go through the answer in a couple of seconds. Okay, so our right answers are FSH and estrogen. And the way I worked this out in my head was that during day 4 to 14, we're going to be having our uterus lining building up, therefore we're going to need estrogen. And whilst the uterus lining is building up, our egg is also going to be developing slowly, and that occurs through the action of FSH. Question 2. Which hormone is responsible for maintaining the lining of the uterus? So pause it again, have a go, and we'll go through it in a few seconds. So progesterone is the right answer. Remember, progesterone maintains the lining of the uterus. Estrogen builds up the lining of the uterus. So be careful at this point. Make sure you know the difference between the action of estrogen and progesterone. When is the egg released and which hormone causes it? Pause it again and we'll go through it. So the egg is released right in the middle of the cycle, day 14, and it's luteinizing hormone which causes egg release via a surge of luteinizing hormone. Now this is known as ovulation, this egg release. Release of which hormone stimulates release of estrogen? So the right answer is FSH. So remember, we have that loop where our FSH is going to be stimulating release of estrogen, and in turn, estrogen is going to suppress release of FSH. We have a nice example of a negative feedback loop here, which we're actually going to be looking at more detail at a later point in this series of videos. So stay tuned for that. And which of the following hormones does progesterone inhibit? So there's going to be more than one right answer here. And the answers are FSH and LH. Now, well done for today. We really have covered a lot of points, a lot of hormones, a lot of interactions between the hormones. So do go back through the video, make some notes, copy down the tables and the graphs. They're really, really useful ways of remembering this information. If you're anything like me, you probably learn better from diagrams as opposed to paragraphs of words. So know your learning style. Perhaps jot down a few of the diagrams that I drew out with you. Thanks for watching this free video from StudyMind. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe to catch our newest videos by clicking below, and leave a comment on a topic you'd like a video on. Click here to watch more videos in our series for GCSE Biology, or visit our website studymind.co.uk for free past paper compilations by topic and specification.